To this next video lesson about the world at war. This is about World War II, 1939 to 1945. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So this is not, this is an overview, all right? So I'm just hitting the big picture stuff. There are some salient details that we will discuss in greater detail in class, but this is meant to be a big picture, an overview of the war. And of course, this is U.S. history, so the focus is on the United States, not Europe. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so here's a timeline. Now, let me move my guy here a little bit. Okay, so you don't need to remember everything in here, but I just wanted to give you like a little bit of an overview, a play-by-play of what happens, right? So in 1933, Adolf Hitler officially becomes Chancellor of Germany. He's in charge. Over the next couple of years, he is going to expand the territory of Germany, as you see. He's going to reoccupy the Rhineland in 36. We're going to get the Munich Agreement in 1938. The Munich Agreement was peace in our time. It's when Neville Chamberlain, the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, actually entered into an agreement with Germany that if okay, you can have the Sudetenland, but you're not going to take anything else. And Germany's like, yeah, sure, as they, cross their fingers and hide their hand behind their back. And of course, then what do? They invade Poland in 1939, and now the world is at war. But the United States isn't going to jump in yet. The United States is going to stay neutral. We're going to stay neutral for quite some time. Matter of fact, we actually passed laws called the Neutrality Acts that mandated that we stay out of it and stay separated. But FDR knew, he saw the writing on the wall. He knew we were going to have to jump in at some point, and he knew that we needed to jump in on the side of Great Britain. So he does pass through certain things, like the Lend-Lease Act in 1941 that was passed. In 1940, we get the draft is reinstated, so that and you can see that FDR is taking steps trying to get ready for the U.S.'s eventual jump into the war. We won't get involved until 1941. There's an attack on Pearl Harbor, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Then in 1941, we jump into the war. And at that point, Germany declares war on us. And so does, and Japan does too. Obviously, we declare war on Japan after they bombed us at Pearl Harbor. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So 1942, we're fully involved in the war. But Germany is still kicking butt and taking names. The tide isn't going to change until D-Day in 1944. That's when the tide of the war is going to shift to favor the Allies. Hitler's going to make a huge mistake when he invades the Soviet Union in 1941. That's going to prove to be disastrous for Germany in the end. So 1944, we have D-Day. The tide of the war starts to change. By 1945, the war ends. Both Japan and Germany surrender by the end of that year. So that is important. Let me bring my guy back up there. Okay. Okay, so see, why remain neutral? When you know the world is involved and it's a big world war, like everybody's involved in, and the United States wants to stay out of it. Well, we're tired. We had huge losses of life in World War I. It was a huge monetary cost. It didn't occur that long ago. Plus, we were getting over the Great Depression. The Americans were not ready to jump into a full-scale European war. We just didn't have it in us. We weren't into getting ourselves involved in what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. Or the Pacific. We wanted to stay out of it. But that is going to prove difficult. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So fascism and communism. Okay, I need you to pause the video and write this down. These are important definitions. Okay, so pause the video. So fascism is an ideology or movement that exalts the nation above the individual, calls for a centralized government with a dictatorial leader, economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. So that's fascism. There are other definitions of fascism, but they basically amount to the same thing. You've got the nation is more important than the individual, and you have a dictatorial leader that serves as the face of that nation, and the dictatorial leader is worshipped. That's fascism. So you had fascism in Germany, you had fascism in Italy. It was originally coined for Mussolini. There were massive economic consequences from World War I, one of which was that parliamentary democracy in both Italy and Germany would prove ineffective. And we'll get to that in the next slide. So the Weimar Republic was a republic set up with a parliamentary democracy in the aftermath of World War I. It was unsuccessful. They had massive hyperinflation, a lot of economic instability, very ineffective parliamentary democracy, and it collapsed. Then it collapsed into what would become Hitler's fascist government. So he and the Nazi Party offered an alternative, and people voted for it. They were desperate. In the Soviet Union, you have communism, but you also have totalitarianism, right? This is characterized by government control over all aspects of life: economic, social, cultural, intellectual, political, all aspects. The government controls everything. The individual doesn't matter. The individual is subordinated to the state, okay? And the masses have to be involved in the regime's goals, and those regime's goals are set by a dictator. In this case, in the case of the Soviet Union, it was Joseph Stalin. Okay, so isolationism versus intervention. So isolationism is a foreign policy belief that favored limited American involvement. Interventionism is the foreign policy belief that favored American involvement. Okay, so isolationism means we want to stay out of it. Interventionism means we want to come into it, right? This was the battle between, should we stay isolationist or should we intervene? What should we do? How should we handle this? So we start retreating from isolationism with FDR. We declared our neutrality, but FDR was clear about who he supported. He changed neutrality laws to allow us to sell supplies to the Allies. So that way we could help support them, at least materially, if not get involved specifically, right? 1940, like I said earlier, the peacetime draft was initiated. In 1941, we get the Lend-Lease Act. Okay, the Lend-Lease Act authorizes the U.S. to lend, lease, or otherwise dispose of all military supplies and equipment to any country whose defense was vital to the U.S. And of course, that was the Allies, Great Britain and France. And to start with, at least, Joseph Stalin and Russia and the Soviet Union. So Pearl Harbor is what gets us involved in the war. It happened on December 7th, 1941. FDR made a speech to Congress where he asked for a declaration of war, and he called it a day that will live in infamy. Japanese bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. This was the this was the center of our Pacific Command, so it was a lot of our military power was based in Pearl Harbor. So it was definitely a big hit. 2,400 Americans died. But it united the U.S. in the way that nothing else ever had done. So we were all like, declare war on Japan. There was only one person who voted against it. This was a first female member of Congress. She was out of Montana. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name right now. Jeannette Rankin, I think. Jeannette Rankin. And she voted against it because she was a pacifist. She also voted against World War I. But she was the only one to vote against the war. Senate unanimously voted for war, and we get the War Powers Act of 1941 that granted the president unprecedented powers to prosecute the war. So that was very important. So you have executive control over all aspects of the war effort and other aspects of governing. If the country is at war, the federal bureaucracy is massively expanded, and we create the War Production Board to get corporations and private business involved in this war effort. So this mobilization for war actually ended the Great Depression. We have the Revenue Act of 1942 that made a lot of tax increases permanent. We have the sale of treasury bonds. 50% of the war was paid through tax increases. And like I said, that was done through the Revenue Act of 1942. They were eventually made permanent. Okay, workers. So workers were scarce after the draft and voluntary enlistment. So women and minorities were able to have access to jobs that they never had access to before because they were taken by white men. But now most of the white men were off fighting in Europe and in the Pacific. So now we need people to come in and man the factories to produce all of the munitions and uniforms and food and everything that was needed for the war effort. So during this time, because workers were so scarce, unions were strengthened and working conditions improved along with wages. Wages rose 70%, which was unprecedented, but corporate profits were even higher. So corporations did well during the war. They did very well. This resulted in some union strikes, and you have the passage of the Smith-Connolly Labor Act of 1943 that granted the president dramatic powers to fight these strikes. So the president could stop strikes in their tracks. It could forbid them, and also outlawed union campaign contributions. So it gave the Smith-Connolly Labor Act, gave the president unprecedented powers to deal with some of the union issues that were coming about, such as the strikes. um, Movement became more militant for civil rights. This is going to expand in the 1950s and 1960s. You have this thing called the Double V campaign, and this was an African-American civil rights campaign called for victory over Nazism abroad and victory over discrimination in jobs, housing, and voting at home. So this was a big civil rights push by the African-American community. They demanded that companies with defense contracts hire more blacks. We demanded, there was an executive order passed in 88002. I can't remember what year off the top of my head. Sorry about that, folks. This formed the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and this was the first step in preventing discrimination. So prohibited discrimination in employment because of race, creed, color, or national origin. So this is the first step to civil rights legislation that would come later in the 1950s and 1960s. So there were massive advertising campaigns designed to recruit women for the war effort. You may have seen the poster Rosie the Riveter with the, and it was your patriotic duty to join the war effort and to help fight for the United States. Latinos during this time also demanded equality. The League of United Latin American Citizens protested segregation practices. But in practice, Latinos weren't as segregated as African Americans were. During the war effort and in the military, African Americans were segregated in completely separate units, whereas Latinos were not. In most cases, they were mixed in with whites. So it was a bit different in terms of how the races were segregated and who was segregated from whom. Okay, so not much social reform at this point because we're too busy fighting the war, right? We're too busy fighting the war. So certain New Deal programs ended when full employment was reached. FDR also proposed a second Bill of Rights. The GI Bill was passed. This would prove essential. The GI Bill was revolutionary in terms of benefits for veterans. And you're talking about 1/3 of the American public were veterans by the end of the war. So this created massive opportunities for veterans, really encouraged people to fight for their country and be a member of the armed services full time, not just during wartime. In 1944, Harry Truman was named the vice presidential candidate, and he is eventually going to take over when Roosevelt dies in office. Okay, so life on the home front, there was a lot of things that people in the home front had to accept. Now, granted, we weren't getting bombed. Like, not like Europe and Asia. Our homeland wasn't under attack in the way that it was in Europe and in Asia. But there was rationing. People planted victory gardens to try to take some of the pressure off of farms to produce enough food for the troops. Popular culture changed to reflect what was happening at the war, on the war. Rationing was really the big thing. So people got little tickets, and you were only allowed a certain amount of butter or meat or basic necessities that people used. We had a shorter school and restaurant hours to conserve power and to conserve oil, so we could have more fuel for the wartime effort, for the war effort. Nationwide speed limit of 35 miles per hour was set to, again, conserve fuel so we could use this for the war effort. 15 million people moved around the country to change jobs and to get access to these wartime jobs that previously didn't have access to. So you have a lot of minorities migrating to cities, and this creates racial strife. And you have race riots in 47 different cities over the course of the war. When we get to civil rights, one of the worst things in our history is the internment of Japanese. We interned Italian and Germans as well, but we interned actual American citizens that were simply of Japanese descent. And these people were relocated to the West Coast in camps for the duration of the war. This was patently unconstitutional, should never have happened. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court upheld the order because they said in times of war, the U.S. government has more powers and can suspend certain civil liberties, just like they did in World War I. They upheld certain things that should have been deemed unconstitutional. So this was one of the horrible results of the war, was the internment of the Japanese and other resident aliens. So, what was Hitler's goal? Institute a new world order with him at the head. Hirohito's goal, control all of Asia. And then, of course, after they got rid of the rest of us, they would duke it out amongst themselves. Allies' goal was to stop this from happening at all costs. So we have two theaters in the war. We have the European theater and the Pacific theater. I'm going to talk about the European theater first, and then we'll jump to the Pacific theater. Now, these were these theater, think of them as just areas. Okay, you have the European area of where we're fighting, and then the Pacific area of where we're fighting. Pacific area was Asia. European theater was Germany and Italy. And in Asia, we're looking at fighting Japan, right? So in the European theater, it's Germany and Italy versus U.S., Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Germany was kicking butt and taking names. The Allies were not doing well. Great Britain was hanging on by a thread. France had fallen to Germany. Most of Europe had fallen to Germany by this point, so it's the Soviet Union and Great Britain really trying to beat Germany back. And they were struggling. Stalin did beat back the German army, started to beat them back in 42, 43. They were completely out of the Soviet Union, Germans were, by 1944. Now, the turning of the tide was D-Day, June 6, 1944. Largest concentration of military forces ever assembled in the history of the world, okay? It was a massive success because we beat back Germany and we retook France for the Allies, but also massive casualties. Sometimes the D-Day is known as the invasion of Normandy because we were invading France to try to push back the Germans, and we did. After the D-Day invasion, you have Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. That was kind of Germany's last stand. And at that point, after we won that battle, Germany continued to get pushed back, but we pushed the German troops all the way back into Germany proper. And then once Berlin was surrounded by the Allies, Germany surrenders in May 1945. Hitler commits suicide in April, right after the Soviet Union made it to, with its troops, made it to Berlin. Germany surrenders in May 1945. A few months later, Japan will surrender, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so we're going to spend more time talking about this in class because it's imperative that we understand what this is. The Holocaust is the single deadliest genocide in the history of the world. Matter of fact, the term genocide was coined from this event. 12 million people were killed. 6 million Jews were exterminated in German concentration camps. 5 to 6 million other folks, and I list the different people who were also rounded up and summarily killed or forced to work. Now, the thing that is also horrible about this is that Western nations would not allow the immigration of these people to their countries. Several ships containing about 1,000 Jews came to the United States asking for asylum. We sent them back. We sent them back to die in German concentration camps. I cannot possibly overestimate the colossal disaster and horror of this event. This was ethnic cleansing at its worst. It's still, historically, the worst genocide to ever take place in the history of the world. So we're going to talk about this more in class, but I need you to know what the Holocaust was. It was a systematic extermination of people the Germans decided were undesirable. Okay, Pacific Theater. So the Pacific Theater, it was more difficult than the European theater, but there were some key turning points. So the Battle of Coral Sea, Battle of Midway Island, Battle of Leyte Gulf. Okay, so you can read that right there. Those were some key battles. Do you have to memorize those battles? No, you do not. Am I ever going to ask you about these battles? No, I am not, because the likelihood of them showing up on the Regents is so unlikely. Like, it's very unlikely that this is even going to show up. But I wanted you to at least have an idea of what the key battles were in the Pacific Theater. Okay, post-war world. You had the Yalta Conference, which took place before the end of the war in anticipation of the end of the war. You have the big three, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, met, and they figured out how they were going to divide the losing people, right? How they were going to divide it up. So division of Germany into administrative districts. We did have some conflicts though. Indians were trying to declare independence from Great Britain, and then how would we handle the Eastern European nations? We also did create the United Nations. Now the Manhattan Project was the project to develop the atomic bomb, okay? This was secret from Congress, it was secret from the American people, and even from Vice President Truman. Truman did not learn of the Manhattan Project until after he took office when FDR died. That's when he was informed. The first bomb was successfully tested on July 16, 1944. We dropped the 2 bombs in August 1945, one on August 6th, one on August 9th, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively. After the bombing of Nagasaki, the Japanese said, okay, we give up, and they unconditionally surrendered after the dropping of that second bomb. And that ended the Pacific Theater. Okay, so end of the day, what do we have? Well, the toll of suffering was enormous. You have 50 million soldiers and civilians were killed. That's about 2.5% of the entire global population. That's huge. You have 100 million wounded, 30 million left homeless. So you have a lot of devastation and destruction. The U.S. does emerge as one of 2 global powers. We are the sole possessors of atomic weapons. We have an undamaged homeland, and we have a massively elevated standing in world politics and economics. Seeds of the Cold War are planted with the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. So there's going to be those 2 global powers, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We'll talk about that in the next video lesson. But the seeds of the Cold War are planted in the end of World War II. And with that, that is the end of this video. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.